Just to maybe have a different perspective and maybe a
Sure.
better perspective from my experiences, because I had a very good family doctor who was one of the first people to help with my mental health conditions, because after my first surgery, where I had a number of complications and things were not going according to plan, he actually took the time to talk to me about that and say, okay, I realized that there were all these things going wrong, because I kept coming back to him for, well, I have this other issue, I have another issue, I have another issue. And he realized, okay, all these issues are there and it's difficult to deal with, but how are you holding up mentally? And through that, he recommended that I take a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, which is a fancy word for meditation. And that was luckily available through my local family healthcare team. So that was something that was OHIP covered. It was available to me. I went to workshops. We met once a week for 8 weeks, learned a bunch of meditative and mindful practices, and that really was really life-changing for me, in all honesty. And I owe all that to a family doctor, who was aware enough of the situation. So that's great.
Yeah.
Not always the case,
No.
as we've seen. But there are a lot of great family doctors out there, and if you are having a hard time getting in to see your GI, which I think we all probably have a hard time doing that because we get to see it maybe once, twice a year, your family doctor is a great access point as well. And even if they're not the most knowledgeable about mental health resources themselves, they may at least be able to point you in the right direction of where to go.
Yeah.
So that was certainly something that was very beneficial for me.
Absolutely. I just want to say one thing. First of all, like you said, it only takes one person, right? It only takes one person to hear you out for you to feel supported. So absolutely reaching out in any way you can. And also what I want to say is that I think another issue is that oftentimes we feel like we're advocating for ourselves because we feel like, the thing is, I can't think about my experience with inflammatory bowel disease without the emotional impact or the mental health impact. To me, they're not separated, because we're holistic, like we're whole beings. You can't separate our emotions from our body, from our mind. And like when you go to these doctors, when you go to a gastroenterologist, and you're going through the biggest health crisis of your life. Like you are in severe pain. I've been in situations where I was like, blood coming out of my stool, crying on the bathroom floor every day, just in the worst pain of my life. And so you think that it's obvious that if you're crying to your gastroenterologist being like, I'm in so much pain, I don't know how to live my life anymore, it's like, that's kind of their everyday thing. Right? It's the hardest thing you've ever gone through. There are times where I genuinely was like, I don't know how I'm going to go on with this. Recovering from the surgeries, I don't know how I'm going to ever live on from this pain and this experience. This is their job. So I think recognizing that you have to be so clear with them. No, like this is really hard for me. I actually need more support. Realizing that even though this is so out of the norm for you, that they're coming from such a different perspective. So they need that clear voice.
Messaging.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I think can be a challenge sometimes too, when you're so sick and you just, day after day it's like this. Sometimes you don't even notice, right? I think what you were saying, Montana, is it took you till you were much older to really reflect on that and say, okay, wow, this is really an issue for me, right? And Rasheed, I don't know if the same was for you, but it sounds like your family doctor was the one who kind of
Was the one who kind of noticed a potential change there, because I think with my GI, who was great and I had a really good relationship with, he was still very much, nuts and bolts, kind of like, how many bowel movements a day do you have? Is there blood in the stool? Okay, what can we take? What kind of medication can we take? Okay, that's not working. What's the next medication we can take? Okay, now we go for surgery. So it was very kind of structured in that way. But that's not to say that he didn't care. I could definitely tell that he did. But maybe the mental health side of things was not something that came to the fore when he was treating me. And now you mentioned the sort of like connection between our minds and our bodies, and that's been pretty well uncovered over the last few years. But have you ever noticed times where your mental health impacted your IBD symptoms, or vice versa? Was there something that you could kind of tell maybe a flare-up was coming on because of how you were feeling emotionally?
So I think that's the really tricky thing, because absolutely. But also, it becomes this vicious, for me, it became this really vicious cycle, because I really blamed myself for my IBD because I knew how much stress my body was under. I hadn't really learned how to cope with my disordered eating habits throughout high school, and I knew that the anxiety that I was under, I just knew that I was going to break somehow, and then I did. I remember being 17 in grade 12, being so scared I wanted to get like the best marks I could for university, and I wanted to just this like obsession with perfection, whatever that means. And when the disease hit, when I ended up, in the hospital, I was sick for like a month, couldn't get out of bed, ended up in the hospital, was diagnosed, and I was like, I did this to myself. And that like feeling of blame and shame and anger towards myself really perpetuated like the stress that I was under, which meant that, I couldn't really get out of that feeling because I would get a flare up and then I would blame myself, and then maybe that stress would perpetuate another flare up. And so people would try to say, to make me feel better, look, like there isn't a connection and like it's not your fault. But that's not quite true either, right? We know that stress has an impact on our bodies, so it's about understanding that connection without that guilt and shame that I found really difficult to cope with. Yeah.
I think, go ahead.
Just in terms of like knowing when my symptoms were, I could tell when my symptoms were getting worse. And there was a time where I was in, I guess you could argue I was in remission, not a whole lot of symptoms, things were okay. And I got into an argument with my dad over something probably very stupid because I can't even remember what it was now. And I remember being very angry, and I could feel like physically warmth throughout my abdomen, and then maybe within a few days to weeks, full-on flare-up. And it's hard to necessarily pin down like, oh yeah, you were angry, so therefore you got a flare-up. I mean, there were probably some other factors as well, because my medications were not doing a great job in their own right. But there were times where I could definitely tell something was amiss because of how I felt emotionally. And so I think it's really important to be able to harness those feelings and know when you're feeling upset and not letting it just overcome you, because that's where it could end up making symptoms worse. And probably vice versa, because if you're feeling crappy about your symptoms, then maybe your mental health's not going to be there. And that's always easier said than done to just say, oh well, hey guys, you're going to the bathroom 20 times a day. But if you think positively about it,
it'll go.
Then all of a sudden that'll make things better. And obviously that's not the case. That's very difficult.
Right. And it keeps remission this place where you're like, better not get angry. I better not be nervous. Yeah. I better not get stressed. And then what happens?
Then you're stressing out about not getting stressed.
Yeah, right. And it's just this horrifying cycle.